Welcome to Terrible Lizards, a podcast about dinosaurs with Dr. David Hone and Iszi Lawrence.
On this week's episode, we talk flappy flap chests, specifically their sternums. Hello and welcome to episode 5 of series 9 of Terrible Lizards. And I know what we're going to be talking about today because we have a flappy flap extraordinaire episode. But we're not concentrating on the flappy bits, we're concentrating on the bits that operate the flappy bits. Dave's face at the moment is in pain. Hello, Dr. Dave Hone. How are you?
All right, thank you. Well, it's partly in pain because it's bank holiday Monday morning and I'm tired.
That is true. I mean, but there are so many bank holidays in May, nobody's going to know what that means or when it is, really.
No, true, yeah. Oh, no, I didn't know this one was on until someone told me last week just how much attention I paid to it.
Well, I think we have more bank holidays in May than we don't. But that doesn't stop the big news announcement, which we did put on the Patreon page and also on the Facebook page, that you have a new paper out about pterosaur sternums.
Or stern up,
or
properly,
stern up.
if we're doing Ponzi plurals, yes. Yeah, and so tough luck, listeners. I'm going to talk about this for 45 minutes. But it is, I think, worth talking about, not because it's a paper of mine, but because I think it actually demonstrates quite a lot of various little bits about paleontology and this, that, and the other, which do come up regularly. So while I do want to talk about pterosaur sterna, there's some bigger picture stuff here. One of which is, and a kind of central part of why I ended up doing the paper, just how little we know about many things that we can know about and just haven't done. By which I really mean the fact that there are not many paleontologists in the world. There are really quite a lot of fossils. And I'm sure I've said this before, but, I regularly get emails or I see comments online going, oh, why haven't paleontologists done this yet? Someone named this animal 5 years ago and they haven't even got round to describing a proper paper of it yet. It's like, yeah, because they're doing other things. And there's not a horde of people working on this stuff. And yeah, the sternum in pterosaurs, I think, is actually a really good example of that. So just in case anyone doesn't know, the sternum is basically a big, I was going to say squares, not square in most of them, a big plate of bone with a bit sticking up from the front of it, as in towards the face, sitting in the front of the chest that the ribs connect to.
It's the bit when you're cutting a roast chicken, so it's the bit that separates two chicken breasts.
Well, sort of, but in birds they have a big keel, so they have a big ridge along the front that sticks out from the chest, and therefore if it's standing up, down towards the floor, if it's flying, down towards the floor. Pterosaurs basically don't have that, they just have the plate underneath.
Like we do.
Yeah, we have a bit of one, but Aussies.
I've got it. It's there. You can hear it thumping.
But it's kind of cartilaginous though, and is still a bit in the middle connected to the roof, so it really doesn't do anything like as much.
They saw through it though when you're having like heart operations, isn't that where they get?
Well, I haven't done one recently, so.
Okay. Paleontologists aren't heart surgeons, people.
But yes, I believe so. But yeah, the reason I think that's super relevant in pterosaurs is obviously the damn things fly, and the sternum is where the vast majority of their biggest flight muscles are going to attach. Because if you think about it, that's from the chest up to the arm, and so if that muscle contracts, what's it going to do? It's going to pull the arm down and towards the chest, which if you're flying means pulling your wings down. That's the flapping action that gives you thrust and lift and lets you fly. So if you're studying a flying animal, this is one of the most important parts of the skeleton for understanding how the muscles operate. Part 1. Part 2, once you start looking at them, as I did for this paper, you find that they are insanely variable. And that's really weird, because as we've definitely talked about in the past, pterosaurs are insanely invariable in loads and loads of different ways. Not just between different groups, but even within groups, you will see they are incredibly similar. That kind of general body plan that you have, cut the heads off, basically. Like most pterosaurs, everything from the earliest Triassic stuff to the latest Cretaceous stuff looks very, very similar, just with some changing proportions. And, okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but not a massive one. And within species, yeah, we've talked about this with Rhamphorhynchus in particular, this wonderful isometric ontogeny where juveniles basically look like miniaturized adults, and all the bone bone proportions and all the joints and all the shapes of the bones are basically identical at small and large size, except for the size of the eyeball. An exception to that is the sternum, which is unbelievably different in Rhamphorhynchus from juveniles to mid-sized animals to adults. And people have known this for, well, so Rhamphorhynchus was considered a many different species for many years, but 1995 or 96, I can't remember which.
That's a long time.
Yeah, it's been nearly 30 years since we recognised that these were basically all the same thing, and descriptions of their sterna, and good illustrations of their sterna around before then, and no one has looked at this. And so, yeah, that's not to go, ooh, yeah, go Dave, and boo, all other...
I'll say that.
Paleontologists.
Yeah, go Dave, boo, all other paleontologists, you're lazy.
Dave
has to do all the work, the important work.
But it is that exact thing of like, I'd start, this paper has been going on for 3 or 4 years. It's taking a long time to come through, and I was showing bits of it and talking to various colleagues and they're going, bloody hell, how have we missed that? How has no one done this? Where has all this come from? Yeah, I'd spotted that and I'd never really thought about it. This isn't some enormous secret that I've uncovered. There are literally papers illustrating this stuff and everyone's kind of just letting it go past and not really thinking about it at all.
Is it because they're not as sexy as crests and other parts of the pterosaur?
So I think in part it's because of the enormous trap that I fell into, which is why this paper has taken years, literally years to get finished, whilst doing other stuff, obviously. And that is because often the sternum is extremely badly preserved, and so it rarely shows up. And often even when it does show up, it's covered by other bones because the arms are in the way or the legs are in the way, or if the animal's face down, like the ribs and the backbone and everything's in the way. And so there aren't many of them, and the ones that there are there often aren't either in great shape or they're covered up. And so part of the reason I started on this project originally is I was looking at it thinking, well, this is something we should really look at. There does appear to be some good variation there. I'm sure there's some really interesting stuff going on which will tell us something about flight and development and relationships of species and all this other stuff. But, there's 15, maybe 20 of them out there. It's not a massive paper. It won't take a huge amount of time. And I think I got to 67 different species represented in this paper, a number of which have multiple good sterna developed, a number of which are highly variable, so you end up describing 2 or 3 different ones. And so, yeah, this monster paper, it's come out at 20-odd thousand words, so about a quarter of the length of one of my books, and then with 24 figures, almost all of which have multiple panels to show things top and bottom and front and back and sideways. And here I have to give an early and massive shout out to artist Sky McDavid, who did almost all the illustrations. Actually, that's a lie. She did all the illustrations. I put some photos in there, and I put some labels and scale bars and the letter A, B, C, D and some arrows on them, but she did absolutely everything else. So yes, enormous credit to her because it makes the paper look spectacular and it massively helps with being able to see all the details and everything. But yeah, this nice quick little paper that I can knock together and sort out the pterosaur sterna in 15 pterosaurs or less turned into this probably 5-year project at this point, and the longest thing I've ever written by a big margin as a scientific paper.
Amazing. I mean, that's what happens when I try to clean something. I notice something else,
yes.
And then you notice something else, and obviously,
or you think, oh, it's not that bad.
Yeah.
I should do the shower. I just need to kind of wipe off some of the grime on the. Oh no, and I should do the edges. Oh, and that handle doesn't look very good.
Yeah.
And, I never got round the grouting, and that's scummier than I. Oh, I better clean the drain while I'm here. Yeah, and then suddenly you're in there for 4 hours.
And also, you've decided to redo the grouting, and then it's a month's project at that point.
Yeah, I mean, one of the comments we got from the referees, one of them said, it'd be really nice if you started incorporating all this new data into a phylogeny, so, a family tree, and plug it all in. But I realised that's a massive amount of work and this paper is huge already. And I'm like, yes, that's why I didn't do it.
I mean, did you think when you were up to maybe sample 22 that you thought, oh, how about we just pick a couple of species rather than trying to do all of them?
Well, the problem is that I'd done quite a few before I'd realised how many more there were. because you just start and you think, oh, well, I'll do all the ones I know about. And, oh, yeah, that paper talked about 4 or 5 different ones. And that paper illustrates 2 or 3 different. I'll put all of that in. Yeah, it's not. I'll just have quick scour around and then see, it wasn't that I was planning on doing a half-assed job, but I wasn't necessarily going to do all of them. And then by the time you got to about 40 and you think, well, I've basically finished and I've done all of them, so I might as well
do the other 27.
I'll hunt down, the last 3 or 4 that I'm probably missing. And then, of course, lo and behold, you just keep finding more and more and more. And then at that point, I'd got to the point where I was asking a few friends and saying, well, look, I know about this one and I've got a drawing of it, but it's a bit rubbish. I know you've seen the fossil. Have you got a photo? And it would be like, oh, yeah, here's that photo you wanted. By the way, have you seen this one? Or I spotted this in a paper the other day. Is it in your? But no, it's not in my paper. And yeah, so it just got bigger and bigger. I'm sure it's not comprehensive now in the sense that there will be ones I missed. Literally since it came out at the time of recording, 2 weeks ago, 3 at a push. This is very new, and there was a pterosaur out yesterday this is a new species and has a sternum in it. So yeah, so I haven't got that one, obviously.
It sounds epic. So let's talk a little bit about the sternum and why they're important. I mean, we already mentioned, I think, on previous episodes that birds have, like you say, this keel-like sternum, which they attach all their flight muscles to. But, the way that pterosaurs take off and the way that they fly is different, isn't it?
Yeah, so that's the first thing to say is the sternum is arguably far more important in pterosaurs than it is in birds, because birds are flying, and so their sternum is massively critical for their flight muscles. But that's all they do with them, effectively. And okay, yes, there are birds that swim, like puffins and gannets and stuff, but they're using a flying action. Whereas pterosaurs have to walk and take off with their front legs as well as fly with them. So that's potentially a much more complicated set of things they need to do and would therefore impinge on things a lot better. Furthermore, pterosaurs also potentially have this kind of weird breathing pump through the way they move the whole chest to actually pump air in and out of the lungs. We don't really know. I discuss it a little bit in the paper. There's a couple of different hypotheses about quite how they might be doing that, and the sternum is kind of integral to all of this. So the sternum is probably potentially doing a lot more or integrated a lot more into various different things that pterosaurs are doing rather than birds.
Just as an aside, I was thinking we should do an episode on respiration, because I know that birds do, they have weird lungs compared to us. And even things like horses have weird breathing, that they can't breathe unless they're moving in a certain way. But that's an aside. Carry on.
Birds, as you say, have this keel. So yeah, if you look at a bird sternum side, if you pulled it off a bird and slapped it down on the table so it's kind of sticking up, it would be, almost a T shape. So, a very wide T shape, but, a big flat plate and then a huge piece sticking up, which is the keel. And that's because, as you correctly say, birds put all their flight muscles, nearly all their flight muscles on the sternum. So they have both the downstroke muscles that pull the wings down, but also the upstroke muscles that pull them back, because they kind of loop up through and over the top of the shoulder.
Those are the mini fillets, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
So pterosaurs and bats don't do that. Pterosaurs and bats are far more sensible and put their upstroke muscles on their back, which is where they should be. So that immediately eliminates some of that issue. But if you look at a typical pterosaur sternum, and I'd say, having completed this paper, there's arguably no such thing quite as a typical pterosaur sternum, which in itself is very interesting. As I say, this is way more variable as an element than I'd expect compared to pretty much any other bit of pterosaur anatomy short of the jaws, which, fair enough, feeding.
And I just want to say, for people who haven't listened to all of our series and everything else, the reason that's unexpected is that this is a mechanical part of the animal. It's not a sort of reproductive feature that looks pretty. It's something that's integral to a very basic movement, being flight. Not that flight's a basic movement, but it is how they're getting around, and therefore you'd expect it to be pretty much the same. If you look at all the mammals, pretty much all of them got femurs. They need legs to walk about.
Well, right, and they all walk about in more or less the same way, and therefore there's a lot of similarity. So yeah, when the rest of the skeleton, again, ribs, the vertebrae, the wings in particular, are incredibly constrained in their morphology. You'd expect something integral to that to also be highly constrained. And it isn't, and that in itself is then very, very odd.
Weird.
A basic pterosaur sternum is 2 components, which actually probably start separate and fuse later on. You have the sternal plate, which is the main kind of flat bit that sits in the chest, and then you have what's called the cristospine, which sticks forwards, so towards the chin, basically. So if you imagine an animal lying down as it's flying, so the plate sits in the chest and this sticks. Well, because I keep wanting to use the word up, but of course up sort of implies out, and it depends on your orientation. So forwards towards the neck and therefore ultimately towards the head. And that also can stick up a bit, or indeed out of the chest, the cristospine specifically, but usually not very much. So it is a kind of little flat rod almost that's sitting forwards. Now, the cristospine, on the base of it, so about the point where it joins the sternal plate, has a couple of kind of almost like thumbprint shapes. So, if you get a big bit of plasticine or blue tack or Play-Doh or something like that and stick your thumbs in and push them together, you'd leave a kind of pair of rounded depression. And these are facets. These are an articulation point for the coracoids. So I think we've mentioned... I know, I'm sorry, this is going to be an anatomically heavy episode and a complicated one because I'm having to describe everything and you can't see it. So, scapulae, we know, are shoulder blades, your arms, your upper arm, your humerus kind of attaches to that, and the coracoid is basically the front equivalent of that. I can genuinely never know, and I'm sure someone will correct you, I can never remember if humans have coracoids or we've got weird ones that kind of fuse to the scapula. We really don't have them in the way that reptiles have them, and boy do we not have them in the way that pterosaurs have them. So a pterosaur scapula is more or less a kind of slightly curved rod, and so is the coracoid, and they fuse together until they're basically a C shape. So they're an almost perfect C.
So they sort of wrap around, like if they wrap around the shoulders almost.
Yeah, they make the front half of the body. So and they literally attach in effectively, or they have three kind of key points. So the ends of the scapulae, so where they kind of start on the back, particularly in big pterosaurs, literally plug into the vertebrae of the spines on the vertebrae of the back. And they have this complicated arrangement in bigger pterosaurs, so don't worry about that. But basically, they touch the spine, and then they come round, and about the midpoint of the C is where the scapula and coracoid fuse together. And that has a big socket in it, and that's the socket for the humerus. So that's your upper arm, and that is what is allowing you to move your arm, and that is obviously in the midpoint, and then you come around to the bottom, and the ends of the coracoids plug into those facets at the base of the cristospine on the sternum. Okay. So you literally have this kind of linking together with the scapular coracoids. That's a proper name, because scapula fuses to coracoids, so we call it scapular coracoids. It's now one thing. So your scapular coracoid is basically attaching your spine to your sternum on both sides, and therefore basically making a ring with the spine at the top and the sternum at the bottom, and then the humeri sticking out the sides. So it makes a super rigid, solid ring box shape of the front of the pterosaur. And so that articulation point for the coracoids is then super important, because it's the apparatus which is holding your wings onto your body, and then the sternal plate has most of the flight muscles attached to it. This is a big deal how this arranges. And then you look at it, and the cristospine can be basically a nub that's like a tiny little spike, or a great big long rod that sits all the way up the front of the chest, or it can stick a long way out of the chest, outwards and forwards, almost like a keel. So the cristospine can be really tiny and be like a tiny little knob or spike that's barely the length of the facet to take the coracoid. It can be a great big long rod that sticks miles out towards the base of the neck. It can actually be really deep and almost have a keel-like shape to it. It can hook over at the end and point back into the chest. It can hook over at the other end. It can extend into a little keel that then runs all the way down the face of the sternal plate. On top of that, there's an even weirder thing with the coracoid articulations, because most of the time, about half the time, they just meet each other. So oddly enough, you'd flip your sternum over and you see these two dimples, one either side of the midline of the sternum, and they just kind of push together, as if you're literally just pushing your thumbs together and they've just met slightly short because there's something in between them. Some of them, though, are asymmetric. One is in front of the other and they overlap. That turns up in birds. I found one line in... I think it's on the Pteranodon paper by Chris Bennett. I've mentioned Chris Bennett before. Unbelievably good anatomist. Wrote the definitive monograph on Pteranodon. It was the first thing I looked at. Oddly enough, he described the sternum in enormous detail and illustrated in 5 views. It was magnificent. A lot of weird things going on in Pteranodon sternums, which we may not get to. But Chris has this throwaway line of, oh yeah, some birds have asymmetric sterna too. Asymmetric coracoid articulations on the sternum too. That's it. And I've not found any reference to this in any other literature. I have not been able to get hold of lots of bird skeletons and start looking for asymmetrical articulations. There's nothing about, is this linked to them being big or being small? Is it only found in some groups? Is it in soaring birds or fast-flying birds or anything? A fairly extensive Google scholar Googling failed to turn up any papers that mention this in birds. I've spoken to a couple of bird anatomists who went, oh yeah, I've heard of that. And that's the limit of their knowledge. So classically, we're in a situation where it now looks like we might know more about the pterosaur sternum than we do about the bird sternum, despite the fact there being quite a few more people working on birds and bird flight. But that's going on. Asymmetry in animals is really, really, really rare. When you look at animals that don't have radial symmetry, i.e. things like sea urchins or
starfish,
jellyfish and things, or no symmetry like corals and sponges and stuff, bilateral symmetry, draw a line down the middle, left and right are basically identical, particularly in terms of the skeleton. Our heart is offset and things like this, and your intestine wiggles around. But usually basically very, 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 very symmetrical indeed. So even a very minor bit of asymmetry like this is really weird. And again, when they're flying, they're flapping. Think of something like Quetzalcoatlus. Quetzalcoatlus has asymmetrical articulation. The power going into launching a 200-kilo animal into the air, and its things offset and point past each other. And you think any force going through that, they're just going to push past and the whole sternum's going to... No, don't do that. That's an appalling idea.
But also it's
what the hell are they doing?
Even if you've got, it's the old joke of if you have one leg slightly shorter than the other, you go around in circles in the desert. Presumably one side would be, beating slightly sooner than the other, or at least stronger than the other, just simply because of the way the muscles would have been attaching.
I don't know what it's doing. Well, right, so there's not a lot of musculature attaching directly to the scapula and coracoids themselves. They're bones there is some, but it's not doing a lot of that flapping stuff. But yeah, if you just think about, those two arms pulling down, they've got to resist something, and this is part of the architecture that is resisting that. You think any asymmetry in that has got to be really bad. You think, oh, well, solution, fuse it all together into a big lump, and then that's kind of going to upset it. No, these are articulation points. They sit there. Even in adults, these are loose bits that fit together. It's incredibly odd, and I'd love to say more about it, but boy, that paper was long enough already, and as I say, I couldn't really find anything on this. So there's a project for someone. Go and look at bird asymmetrical articulations. And also, a biomechanicist can tell me what the hell's going on. I suspect the answer is actually very little at all, or very little bad at all, otherwise it wouldn't do it. And moreover, I expect there's actually a huge advantage to doing it, otherwise it wouldn't turn up in so many different groups and be retained for so long. But I don't know what that is either. I'm not a good enough mechanicist. It's weird as hell. So your cristospine, madly variable, and then your sternal plate, that can be basically pretty narrow, thin strip down the middle, or kind of triangular, getting bigger towards the bottom, or an inverse triangle, so being wide at the top or at the front, and then getting narrower further down. It can be nearly circular, it can be kind of shield shape, it can be nearly square. It may have serrated edges down the side. It may have a serrated edge along the bottom, again to the rear, more correctly. It may have a thickened edge along the front. It may have a bit of a ridge and a thickened keel down the middle, and it may or may not have an extra big projection off the bottom, at the posterior end, so pointing backwards, and at least in a couple of cases, including Pteranodon, some floating bits of gastralia, so those odd little kind of rods of bone that kind of float around the ribs and kind of hold the chest together, confused to the sternum and be fully integrated with it.
Of course.
So that's the degree of variability we see in the sternal plate and the cristospine. Absolutely extraordinary levels of variation in all of that.
And once again, this is the thing that attaches the muscles.
Your downstroke muscles.
Yeah.
And they're probably using for launch. So non-trivial amount of very, very core musculature for these animals is attaching to this. And they're insanely thin. So I described a sternum years ago from an indeterminate azhdarchoid, so something vaguely close to Quetzalcoatlus, Tapejara, Sinopterus, and a whole bunch of other animals. But there's no head, and it was a young animal, so you can't really tell. Described by my then PhD student, Ross Elgin. Very, very thin indeed. So this was an animal, kind of 2-ish metre wingspan, and the sternum was about a millimetre thick. Oh, and pneumatized. because of course it is. So they pneumatize their sterna.
So it's like got air in the middle of it, like some sort of like Pop-Tart of air.
Mostly in the cristospine, and at that point where the cristospine kind of joins the sternal plate and it's actually kind of thicker at the front end. But at least some of them it carries almost all the way through. There's usually some holes at the base of the cristospine for the air sacs to invade, but at least a couple of the sterna have holes in them. And I don't mean like what we call a pneumatopore, a hole for this air sac system to invade. No, literally just like someone drilled a circular hole front to back just through the middle of it, like a couple of piercings.
But these presumably have a huge amount of pressure going through them because you've got the entire wind structure pulling on them.
Yes. Yeah, you think they'd just pull themselves apart or... Yeah,
Snap.
I don't know. Right, so next weird thing about pterosaur sterna. No, I know, it keeps going. There's a reason this paper is so bloody long. And this, again, we're not even really touching on all the variation and all the implications of that. So next weird thing, I said they're often very badly preserved, even in skeletons which are extremely well preserved. There's a couple of pterodactylus/aerodactylus, depending on exactly whose taxonomy you follow, basically the same thing, from the Solnhofen, where you've got, like, the wings are preserved, like, you know, the soft tissue wings, even the propatagium, the little front wing that sits in the kind of crux of the elbow, which is super, super rare. There's like 4 pterosaurs ever that preserve that. And this has got it. Sternum's rubbish.
Weird.
Just barely preserved at all. It's just like a fractured mess that there's only about half of it is there. And you keep seeing this, even in extraordinarily well-preserved specimens, the sternum is rubbish. Or it's fallen apart and the cristospines come off, or you only get a cristospine and no sternal plate.
Well, I'm not surprised if it's full of holes.
More importantly, I think it's cartilage. And that's why it doesn't preserve. It's why it doesn't show up a lot of time, even in the really, really good ones, because it's simply not bone. And so it hasn't preserved very well. And as at least some listeners will know or will remember, so most bones, basically all bones, effectively start off as cartilage and then turn to bone later. Now, there's some interesting things going on there, obviously. First of all, pterosaurs, when they hatch, are extremely well developed. They have far more fully formed bones than you would normally expect for another animal, particularly a flying animal, and this is one of the big reasons we think pterosaurs can fly basically out of the egg, because they have ossified, so they've turned cartilage to bone in almost all the major flight apparatus in a way that bats and birds don't, because they don't need to fly, they need to concentrate on growth. Embryonic pterosaurs are very, very well ossified. It's a very unusual feature of them. And yet the sternum bloody isn't. The thing that all their flight muscles attached to is still cartilage when they're about 75% grown, as far as I can tell. Because you keep finding them with weirdly badly preserved sterna, or they're weirdly different shapes, or they're weirdly asymmetrical, or the bone isn't properly formed and it's all broken and a mess. Why? Because it's probably still cartilage. So even though loads of animals spend loads of their time with a very cartilaginous major attachment point, indeed chickens are a good example of this. If you pull a chicken sternum off your carcass, it's very bendy. There's a lot of cartilage there and not that much bone. That's a slight cheat if you've got a domestic chicken, but even if you've got something like a pheasant, which of course are much more wild inverted commas, or grouse or guinea fowl or eating any of these other bird or pigeon, the sternum is actually quite cartilaginous, but it's extremely cartilaginous in pterosaurs, even when they've got a lot more bone going on. And another big thing is, do you know what tends to make cartilage turn into bone in a lot of cases?
I mean, age, I think.
Stress.
Ooh.
And I don't mean stress as in, oh God, my exams are next week. It's anatomical stress. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So in other words, flying, that really energy-intensive, force-laden thing, is exactly the kind of thing that you'd think might ossify a sternum.
I mean, it does sound as well that they're going to be mega flexible, so they'll be able to clap their wings behind their back and even hug themselves backwards, just because of the way that if their things are crossing at the front, so that they can even. Well,
so I don't think those things aren't crossing. They're just not meeting tip to tip. They're just sitting alongside each other. Yeah, but it's going to be, it should do some weird things to the forces, and clearly it isn't, otherwise they wouldn't do it, but I don't know what's going on. But in this case, it's just so weird that they ossify everything so young, and then on top of that, they actually fuse a lot of bones together as part of their growth, which lots of animals don't. Pterosaurs fuse the scapula and coracoid. They fuse bits of the wrist together. They fuse bits of the foot together. They fuse some other bones or reduce them massively, and then do some interesting things like this all over the skeleton, to the point that we use these in part to diagnose how old an individual is which bones have ossified and which bones have fused together and joined and which ones haven't. And yet the sternum, even in nearly adult animals, still appears to be mostly cartilage. So these are kind of super bony animals which tend to make, obviously they're very light, but they tend to, get rid of cartilage and replace it with bone much, much earlier than you would expect from almost any other animal of their size or their age. And still, arguably the biggest, most important thing for attaching their flight muscles after the actual humerus and the base of the wing, just cartilage, and it's really weirdly variable. So like I say, they have these little serrations down the side in a lot of them, and that's where the ribs are attaching. Some of them have different numbers of those serrations. So are they attaching 6 ribs on one side and 5 on the other? What? Why would you do that? This is your flight apparatus in a insanely conservative animal, which looks basically identical from when it hatches to when it dies, and it's 10 times bigger. But it doesn't matter how many ribs we attach.
Do you know what I'm thinking of?
What the hell are they doing?
You know what I'm thinking of? You remember back in the 2000s-ish, there were these bendy buses that they introduced in London.
Yes.
Which are really
Briefly.
rigid at both ends, and then with the wiggly bits in the middle. But it does feel like that like the centre of them, like all their extremities are really sort of like tough and put together and like cannot be moved, but the middle is like squidgy.
A bit, yes. But it's just a whole series of oddities, and there's this kind of concept of animals being well engineered and well designed. Yeah. And I think this is where engineers, I'm sure we've moaned about engineers before, but in particular, it's engineers trying to interpret biological anatomy and are just constantly flummoxed by it because it doesn't conform to how they do anything. But even this seems a really bad way of doing it, and not how anything else does it, and just, breaks your own internal pterosaur logic of, we fuse everything and we make sure it's bony very, very, very early. What about the bit that makes you fly? Oh no, we're not worried about that. What?
Maybe flight's a lot easier than we realise.
I mean, I wouldn't hold to that as a primary hypothesis. I mean, what's going on?
Lots of things can do it, and look at ladybirds. They're ridiculous when they start.
Yes,
to fly.
They're flying at a slightly different scale.
They are,
and have some different properties
and they're very bony in terms of having an exoskeleton.
Yeah, they are. Those are kind of the main enormously unhelpful takeaways. Sterna are insanely variable, which you wouldn't really expect. They ossify really, really late, which you wouldn't really expect. They're doing some very odd things with how they vary, so things like the asymmetry on that joint, whether or not there's holes in the middle of the sternum for no apparent reason whatsoever, whether or not those little serrations and things line up or don't, and then, very variable between species, and again, even within species. And they're simultaneously very rare, I think, because they're mostly cartilage, and even when they're not, very, very, very thin indeed, and tend to just fall apart or get covered up. But actually, there's really quite a few of them. So I should say, I got to like 63, 64 taxa. Loads of those are like, there's a chunk of bone in the right place in an otherwise intact articulated skeleton. This kind of has to be the sternum, but beyond there being a blob of bone there, I can't tell you anything. Or there's a lot of tips of cristospines and the very anterior bit of the sternal plate and nothing else. So Quetzalcoatlus, which is actually known from quite a lot of material, it always was, it just never got described. There's finally this big monograph 2 or 3 years ago. They described 2, if not 3, sterna for them, and they're just cristospines, and then the front of this little kind of slightly thickened ridge of the very front of the sternal plate, and that's it. And again, super big animal, massive animal, very, very well preserved in the grand scheme of things. A lot of big stuff, a lot of flight muscles, a lot of walking muscles. It's a big Ajdarchid, big heavy animal, should need lots of power. You'd think the sternum would turn up. Nope. It's just a lump up the front.
Now, I hate to sound like Dr. Dave Hone, but you have something which is cartilage, very variable between species, tends to actually ossify in adulthood, when it's sort of like permanent and that sort of thing, or not at all, and therefore is still cartilage and very variable. Sounds to me like it might be, a reproductive thing, that maybe there's a certain lovely shape that they like, a really flat stomach. I know women obsessed with six packs. So is that what we're looking at here? I mean
Probably not. And there's, so in at least a couple of cases, we've probably got, for things like Pteranodon and Darwinopterus, actually, we've probably got males and females represented, and they don't appear to be any different. There does appear to be variation in that posterior bit, so pointing back down towards the legs, basically, so the opposite direction to the Christus spine. There's what's called a xiphoid process, so a kind of teardrop shape attached to it that points down, and that's, I think it's Nyctosaurus is the only pterosaur that has a really good one, and there's very obviously this big bony teardrop shape there that sits and I think is fused, but I can't remember exactly if that's made, but I'm pretty sure it's fused on. But a bunch of others have a really flat posterior margin, and then there's a big point right in the middle, like exactly the kind of thing you might attach a xiphoid process to, and then it never turns up in any of the others. So that's something where, again, there might be a cartilaginous xiphoid process in basically all of them, and it's just never preserved. And that would kind of make sense, because in some ways, Nyctosaurus is actually really well ossified. Nyctosaurus is this super saurer, like the absolute albatross mimic. It's got rid of its fingers and just walks on little stumps. It's got really weird wing proportions and super tiny legs. If you're like this ultra flyer, maybe that's... And also Nyctosaurus has ossified... tendons in its wings. They're the only group of pterosaurs that have ossified tendons, which is something turkeys have and a lot of other big heavy birds. So Nyctosaurus is kind of more ossified in a bunch of ways than your average pterosaur, and it's got a really well ossified sternum in general, and is the only one with an ossified xiphoid process. That makes me think the xiphoid process is really quite common. It just doesn't show up in basically anything else. And of course, if that's true, you then got this whole extra bit of articulation stuff sitting in the kind of over the abdomen and pointing towards the pelvis that we've basically never seen, except in one taxon, or at least we've never considered being present in any of the others. Which, when there are, as I say, a couple of different competing models about how the chest fundamentally operates in terms of things like breathing and where the muscles articulate and how they're integrated with the pelvis, potentially becomes quite important. And we've just never even considered this.
So the whole, all Izzy's understanding is, so it could be that they're breathing from their bellies like you're supposed to in yoga. But
pretty much. So a bunch of things do this. So tortoises are a classic example. So tortoises and turtles and other chelonians have what's called the hepatic piston. They literally breathe with their liver. And the reason for this is, when you think about how we breathe, what we do is you're expanding your chest. You're trying to make your chest bigger. You're pushing it out. That is increasing the volume, lowering the pressure. It draws airs in and vice versa. What is a tortoise? It's a box. It's fused its rib cage.
It's a rib cage,
and it's fused its rib cage to the shell, and then it's fused the bottom, the plastron, to a box. So you've got nothing to change shape. It can't get bigger or smaller. Yes, there's some hingeback tortoises and some other, but fundamentally, so what they have is the hepatic piston. There's basically a few little muscles attached to their liver, and the liver, because obviously it's a dirty, great big organ that sits right across the middle of the body, they push that forwards and backwards, and that's what moves the space inside the tortoise.
So instead of having a diaphragm, they've just got a liver.
Yes, they pump the liver, basically. It's obviously a bit more complicated than that, but that's largely what they do. So, pterosaurs have kind of the same problem. Their ribs are articulated with their sternum is solid, their back is solid. How do you breathe? Well, one thing we've always considered is that they have these extra little bones called the prepubes. They have these little flat plate-like things that sit in front of the pubis, so in other words, the front bone of the pelvis, about where a diaphragm would be, and we've assumed that that's somehow kind of integrated, and the prepubis is kind of pushing forwards and backwards or in and out, and that's doing some pumping action. And I still think that's probably the case in some way. But it's also been suggested that basically the sternum and all of the articulated stuff, and again, the scapular coracoids are kind of integrated in this, might kind of shift forward and backward a little bit and produce a similar kind of effect. And it's also then for a question of quite where the sternum sits in the chest, because depending on what angle, not where it sits as in, is it pushed up right under the chin or is it all the way down in the abdomen? No, it's definitely in the front of the chest. But if you can imagine seeing your pterosaur side on, we would genuinely say it's got something of a like cone-like body. It's bigger at the front and then tapers down to a relatively small pelvis and small legs. So you're kind of looking at a triangle that doesn't taper very much in side-on view. So is the sternum kind of the first part of that triangle, and therefore it basically points at an angle back towards the pelvis? Or is it flat? Is it basically parallel to the back and then it goes up? In other words, you've got more or less a kind of pentagonal shape, because you've now got a flat sternum that is parallel to the backbone, and then it goes up. And that's actually been quite a big question into how the pterosaur chest operates. And actually, we might be able to solve that with the right 3D specimen, because if you've got a fixed articulation point in the backbone for the scapula, and we do in some, and the scapula and coracoid are fused into a single block, and you've got a fixed articulation point for the coracoid at the front, those have to sit in exact positions. Otherwise, those articulations would be out of joint. And so I know of a specimen where this can be done, and it's one of the things I'm hoping to work on, where we've got the articulation point in the back, we've got a complete scapular coracoid, and we've got a sternum with a good enough coracoid facet that we can fit all three elements together. In digital space, it needs scanning, that's step one, but if we can do that, we can work out, is basically the sternum kind of at an angle, or is the sternum flat? And that would really, change the shape of it would change the shape of the pterosaur torso. That alone is potentially quite a big deal in terms of how volumetric is it, how much space is in there, how big could their lungs be, how could big their other organs be.
How much fish could they eat?
Right, but then it will also change where some of those muscles sit and articulate for flight and walking and launch and other things, and it would also then change, or it would not necessarily prove, but it would definitely support one breathing model or the other, because they rely on different articulations of the sternum to operate. And so, of course, if actually putting it back together matches one and doesn't match the other, that's fairly big which way that arm would swing.
Is Iguanodon walking on all fours or not? This is big.
Well, yeah, for me and about three other people. But yeah,
well,
which is the niche nature of paleontology.
We have more listeners than three, Dave.
Yeah, but how much do they care?
Three. They care a lot. Of course they care. Who could not care about the shape of a pteranodon's profile?
Yeah, I know.
It matters because, if you want to put them in a fancy belt or something, they're going to have really cinched waists if they've got a big, chunky sort of chest.
Yeah, very, very much. So that's kind of largely it. I mean, the only other last bit is something about that development and growth, because there is a question of, there's actually a whole bunch of chest elements in your ancestral reptile, and it's a question of exactly which bits are integrated to make this kind of complicated sternum and which bits go where. To my knowledge, there's only one even vaguely published hypothesis about this from a German guy called Rupert Wield, who published this wonderful paper in 83, something like that. May have even been 78.
Quite a while ago?
Yeah, a while back. In German, annoyingly. It's an Italian specimen described in German.
Sehr gut.
I know, a young Eudimorphodon, and you could see some very differential textures on the sternal plate, suggesting that they were basically ossifying at different rates, because ancestrally they're different bones and different bone types fusing together. And he put together a hypothesis of basically how those elements would all sit together, and it doesn't quite match with our modern understanding of the ancestral condition for these, particularly because Wild was writing at a time when pterosaurs were considered to be really quite early reptiles in the grand scheme of things. And the idea that they might be close to dinosaurs was out there, but it wasn't particularly well supported. And of course, now that idea has only got bigger and bigger and bigger over the last 25, 30 years, and it's now basically entirely established that pterosaurs are very close to dinosaurs indeed, which means they're archosaurs, and not just archosaurs, but actually quite derived archosaurs, and those have a fairly different chest arrangement of bones. In the ancestral condition, it's already changed quite a lot from lizards and other reptiles. So if you start from a different position, and then actually if you look through a couple of other pterosaurs that I uncovered with similar issues with the way that their things are ossifying, and again I found another pterosaur from Germany with some UV photos from a colleague called René Lauer, who let let me look at her specimens and then took photos of them, then let me put it in the paper. More coming on work with Renee and her husband Bruce, possibly in the next issue, depending on the next episode, depending on when the next paper comes out. But you can actually see a similar pattern in a Solnhofen animal compared to this Triassic one. But also subtly different, and it better lines up with an Archosaur ancestry.
Remind me very quickly, because I know, and I should know when Solnhofen is. It's
Jurassic, late Jurassic.
Late Jurassic. Thanks.
Yeah, so we're talking about 70 million years later, and now in the pterodactyloids, not the ancestral rhamphorhynchoids. So again, very different in terms of evolutionary history, much later animal, and yet it still appears to be doing basically the same thing. Again, ironically, pointing to that massive conservatism of pterosaurs in terms of their anatomy. So I've proposed a subtly different version of Field's initial suggestion. I think he got it like 90% right. It's virtually the same as Field's, but a slightly different version of what's happening with the clavicles, because they do appear to be integrated with the sternum, which is quite neat, and that hopefully gives us a slightly better answer as to what's going on with the origin of the sternum, full stop. I mean, I'd love to do some comparisons to birds. Andrea Cow, who's looked at this stuff, has already left a comment on my blog about, this is interesting, but I need to go and have a look at that. And as I say, there's potentially some real influence on phylogeny here, how pterosaur groups are related to one each other. Because I think we've talked about this before, pterosaur phylogenies, they're a bit of a mess and lots of people disagree over lots of subtleties. But more importantly, because the data is often so very, very fragmentary, often these groups are supported by only a handful of characteristics. There might be 2 or 3 features which are holding an entire group together or its exact position in our analyses. Whereas for things like, there's some confusion over some dinosaurs, but usually you're talking about like 15 or 20 major characteristics. And yet basically no one's looked at the sternum properly. The most characters I could find that anyone had ever coded for the sternum was like 4 in a paper that had about 250 characters. So this is tiny component of our analyses. And even that was like, long, short cristospine, wide or narrow sternal plate, symmetric or asymmetric articulations of the coracoid. Like, that was it. And there's the ridges and the keel and the serrations down the side and the serrations down the bottom and the xiphoid process and whether or not the cristospine is long or short or hooked or not, or sticks up or sticks down or sticks back, and is it pneumatic, or does it have holes in it? Like loads and loads of stuff is going in here. And so doing some work coding up some of this stuff and putting it in is potentially really important. There was actually a really cool paper on the pterosaur pelvis that took this approach. It was actually a bit of a model for my paper where they went, no one's ever looked at the pterosaur pelvis, and that's like crucial for walking and, major things like this. And it's obviously
laying eggs.
Really variable. Yeah. Described a bunch of them, coded off a bunch of characters. Now, it actually didn't make a big difference to any of the analyses, but what it mostly did is showed that actually the pelvis is largely in step with the others. In other words, the group that was already distinguishing for these features, actually it's got a couple of unique features in the pelvis as well. These two groups we thought went together, and actually they share a couple of features in the pelvis as well.
That's a relief.
Yeah, so I'd actually expect that more to happen than anything else. I don't think coding a bunch of sternum characters is going to suddenly start overturning a bunch of long-held relationships, and even those that are held together by tenuously by only like 2 or 3 characters. I don't think we're suddenly going to find 5 sterner characters that completely flip that around and move them about. But we kind of need to look at this because it might. And either way, it's one of those classic bits of science, I think, where it's very useful either way. Either that tenuous group is going to fall apart because it was tenuous, or that tenuous group is going to be shored up and actually be much more confident that we're right. So it's really worth doing either way, but I wouldn't want to bet which way it's going to go for at least a couple of these.
Can I ask a basic question, which you might cut because I don't know if you know the answer or why it's important, but the idea that, because I was interested in the fact that these sternums have different edges and that sort of thing. So why do you have crinkly edges versus smooth surface of bone? What does that tell us about the bone and what it's being used for?
So I think what's going on is, the ribs, the main ribs coming off the spine and coming around to the front, they're basically attached to the sternum, almost certainly with cartilage, a bit like ours are actually, and sort of fused together, or at least held in place by cartilage. And I simply think the difference between those those serrated edges and those kind of smooth edges is basically whether or not the bone of the sternum is almost meeting the rib and kind of starting to fuse to it and is just held on with a little bit of cartilage, or whether there's like almost a big cartilage sheet that the ribs are sitting in and then the bone is only part of that. I think that's definitely true for at least some, because you look at things like the juvenile Rhamphorhynchus, and they have this enormous ossified cristospine, and then the sternum is actually very, very thin and only expands at the bottom, or towards the pelvis.
Yeah.
And so that means that, like, well, hang on, we've got ribs, they're the same length as all the others. That means those ribs are going to be hanging, like, just in the chest, half an inch, which is a lot on a little, we're talking about, less than a cat-sized, I'm trying to think of a rat. Think of like a rat-sized body of an animal.
Flying fox might be a good,
Right, I think more people have probably held a rat than a flying fox.
I don't think many people have held rats, Dave. I'm sorry, but
You've seen rats up close, probably.
I've
more
held
so
rats. I like rats. They're cool. But lots of people don't like rats.
But anyway, sorry. So think about like a rat-sized body of this small Rhamphorhynchus. And then there's 7-8 millimetre, getting on for half an inch gap on each side from the sternum to the rib, but they've got to be held together because otherwise the ribs will just float around and move every time it tries to flap its wings. I'm sure there's a giant piece of cartilage hanging all of that stuff together, and it just doesn't preserve. But it therefore tells you something interesting about the ossification patterns of what's going on, and it means there really must be quite a lot of cartilage in there, and that probably explains those differences of things like those serrations versus smooth edges.
Wow. So you're happy you wrote it then?
I'm happy it's done. Well, because once I got about halfway through it, it's just like, well, God, I can't, probably sunk cost fallacy, but it's like, I'm not throwing away all this work that I spent months doing, and now some people know about it going, oh, Dave, when's that coming out? It's like, God, I've done like half of it. And and because, I wrote it on my own, and again, that's not a...
That's not typical.
Well, it's not, but it kind of meant that there was no one else I could lean on. But the flip side is it also meant there wasn't time pressure from anyone else where I'd promised someone I'd get this project done, or we had a deadline in mind, or we were trying to get it ready for this conference or whatever. I could just keep picking away at it. And of course, inevitably that meant either I kept finding more things or papers were published describing Sterna while I was working on it. One came out between me submitting it and then getting the corrections from the referees, and I did kind of dash off the corrections and get it back. So the last thing I need is a couple more papers coming out, and indeed, as I said, I've just missed one at least. So yeah, it was. I'm very pleased with it as a piece of work. I think it's one of the better things that I've done. There's a huge amount of information in there. I would hope, certainly, that eventually, which is a critical word, it's going to generate quite a lot of research, because, as I say, it touches on ontogeny, it touches on phylogeny, it touches on major aspects of evolution, it touches on major aspects of biomechanics and diversity, and all these other things that are going on with, how pterosaurs functioned as living organisms. It presents the solutions to basically none of those, but at least all the data is in one place, and that's that classic thing of, and arguably actually points to my position, where, again, many people know I'm basically in a teaching position, not a research position at university. And there's these huge problems associated with research, because now everything must be measured and metricized. And it means if your research isn't reaching lots of people and appearing in sexy journals and generating other sexy research, people don't want to know. Not because scientists aren't interested in that, but because they're being put in a position by universities and governments to do that kind of stuff. Pterosaurs are not that popular. Basic anatomy is not that popular. A massive paper like this, even something this length and this complexity with so much data in it, and again, those wonderful illustrations from Skye McDavid, like, lots of people are going to read this and go, that solves a problem. I was looking for that everywhere, and it's in the home paper, or it's just available. But it's not in Nature solving pterosaur flight. And it is exactly the kind of paper that most people now don't publish, not because they're unwilling or unable, but that, well, they are effectively unable because they're put in a position where doing it is actively detrimental to your career. And yet, as everyone will tell you, papers like this are the backbone of science, and particularly paleontology, where if you don't know what fossils you've got and what data there is, everything else is almost impossible. And, these big sexy papers that do come out looking at diversity matrices and extinction rates, they are all built on papers like this, and these papers don't get the credit they deserve. And so it is important in that regard.
Fiddly grunt work. And it is it's the shoulders. You're the shoulders that giants will stand on, or something. Or no, you're the giant.
Giant, yes.
Yeah, you're the giant, obviously.
I'm working on the diet.
We're both giants, we're very tall people. No, I have archaeology friends. My friend Julia spent, I think, most of her summer measuring tiny, tiny bits of metal that was found in this particular site and making it, basically, you know, like the floaters in your eyes. She's just got papers just full of drawings of those floaters in your eyes, which are really important. And yeah, it is what science is. It's the detail that matters. It really does.
Yep.
Obviously, Dave, you sacrificed a lot for your career, not only doing this sort of, you know, very detailed, important science, but also, you know, letting me call the episode Flappy Flap Flap Chests.
Letting is a strong word. Protesting strongly but being unable to solve it because you ultimately upload it.
I do ultimately upload it. But it does mean we get to do the pterosaur goodbye.
You want to rock, don't you?
I want to. I just do. It's just such such a good noise. But you get to do it too, Dave. So you get to. Yeah, he's got his thumbs up.
That's my reward, is it?
It is your reward. You make people happy.
The
with
word
your
reward
science.
is doing some very heavy lifting.
Okay, so after 3, 1, 2, 3.
Thank you for listening to Terrible Lizards. For extra content, please go to patreon.com/Terrible Lizards. For questions, contact us there or on terriblelizardspod@gmail.com. Buy Dave Hone's dinosaur books, including How Fast Did T-Rex Run? And to find out about Izzy's podcasts and books, head to iszi.com. Say hello on social media using the hashtag Terrible Lizards. Thank you so much for listening. A review, a recommend and a follow makes all the difference. Stay stompy.